She built a new life under a fake name, a new city, a new identity. She thought she'd escaped forever, until her father called at 2 a.m. with 4 words that destroyed everything she'd built. Come home. It's over. One ancient contract, one criminal dynasty, one groom who never showed up to his own wedding. And when she finally met the man she'd just married, he was sitting in a wheelchair, staring at her like she was already a problem he needed to solve. This is the story of 2 broken people trapped inside someone else's plan. And what happens when the plan stops working? If this story hooks you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. Nyla Brooks was in the middle of a set. 400 people packed into Club Meridian's underground floor, bass rattling the walls, strobe lights cutting the dark in white pulses. When she felt her phone vibrating against her thigh through the pocket of her cargo pants, she ignored it the first time, ignored it the second. The third time she glanced down and saw the name on the screen. Her fingers slipped off the crossfader and the track stuttered hard enough that the crowd felt it. Marcus Brooks. She hadn't spoken to her father in 14 months. She let it go to voicemail, finished the set, handed the booth over to the resident DJ with a nod, and walked straight to the back corridor without stopping to talk to anyone. The noise from the floor dropped behind her as the fire door swung shut. She stood in the hallway beneath a single flickering light, staring at the phone in her hand. 3 missed calls. No text. Her father didn't text. Texts could be screenshotted. Marcus Brooks had been careful his entire life. She called back. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand. "You need to come home," he said. No greeting, no apology for the hour. That was Marcus. Even at 71, even with whatever was happening, he didn't waste breath on ceremony. "I'm not coming home," Nyla said. Her voice was flat. She'd had this conversation in her head enough times that the real version felt scripted. "Nyla." A pause. She could hear him breathing. "Brooks International is done. We have maybe 4 months before the creditors move. The board is already—" "That's not my problem. It is your problem." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That had always been the most unsettling thing about Marcus Brooks. He delivered catastrophic information in the same tone other men used to order coffee. "Your grandfather built that company from nothing. You know what it meant to him. You know what it means to this family." Nyla pressed the back of her head against the concrete wall. Above her, the light buzzed and flickered. Down the hall, she could hear muffled bass from the floor, the pulse of it, the crowd moving in that collective wave she'd spent 7 years learning to control from behind a pair of CDJs. "Tell me what you actually want," she said. "Stop building up to it." Another pause. Longer this time. "There's a family, Korean. They've offered to absorb our debt and restructure the company under a joint holding structure. Full acquisition of our outstanding liabilities in exchange for— In exchange for what?" Her father was quiet. "Dad." "There's a contract," he said. "An old one, between our families. Your grandfather signed it 22 years ago as a gesture of partnership. At the time it was symbolic. No one expected it to be. Enforced." The word landed between them like something heavy dropped on tile. "They're enforcing it now," Marcus said. "They want the marriage." Nyla didn't move for a long moment. The light above her buzzed. The bass from the floor pulsed through the wall against her spine. "I'm not a piece of paper Granddad signed in 2003, she said. "No. You're a woman who has been living under a fake name in Chicago for 7 years, DJing in a nightclub, while your family's company— the company that funded your education, your start, your entire life before you decided to disappear— falls apart." He paused. "I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling because I'm out of options, and because you're the only one who can fix this." She almost hung up. She had her thumb over the button and everything. But she thought about her grandfather, Elijah Brooks, a man who had built an empire from a single machine shop in Detroit, who had held her hand at her mother's funeral and told her that the Brooks family did not break. A man who had been dead for 3 years and could no longer protect what he'd made. "Who are they?" she asked. "This Korean family." Her father said the name. She didn't recognize it. She wrote it on her palm with a pen she found in her pocket. Seo. Because she didn't trust her memory when her hands were shaking. She flew to New York the next morning. She told herself she was going to assess the situation. She told herself she wasn't agreeing to anything. She told herself a lot of things on that flight. The way people tell themselves things when they've already made a decision and aren't ready to admit it yet. The Brooks family home in Westchester was the same as she remembered and completely different. The way places always are when you've been gone long enough. The entrance hall was immaculate, her father's doing, appearances above everything, but she could see smaller things. A crack in the baseboard near the kitchen door. Bare patches on the wall where paintings had been removed. The kind of details that told the real story when the person who lived there had run out of energy to maintain the fiction. Her father met her in the study. He looked smaller than she remembered, which disturbed her more than she expected. Marcus Brooks had never looked small. He slid a folder across the desk without preamble. She read it standing up because sitting down felt like surrender. The contract was real. Dated November 2003, signed by Elijah Brooks and a man named Seo Byung-chul, patriarch of the Seo family. The language was formal, almost archaic in places, drawn up by lawyers who'd been paid to make something irregular look conventional. A partnership agreement, a commitment of alliance, and buried in Clause 14, a marriage provision. Should either family's primary heir remain unmarried by a certain age, the provision could be activated by mutual consent of the surviving patriarchs or their legal successors. Elijah Brooks was dead. Marcus, as legal successor, had already signed the activation. "You signed this," she said. "You already agreed." "I had no choice." "You had a choice. You chose wrong." She dropped the folder on his desk. "Who is the groom?" "His name is Seo Kang-jae. He's..." "How old?" 34. "What does he do?" Her father met her eyes. "He runs the family." She understood what that meant. She'd done her research on the flight, read everything she could find about the Seo name, and what she found had not been reassuring. The Seo family was one of Korea's oldest and most powerful criminal organizations. Not the kind that operated in shadows and back alleys, but the kind that had evolved into something almost institutional. Fingers in legitimate business, connections to political structures, a reach that stretched across Southeast Asia and into markets in Europe and North America. The kind of organization that governments occasionally investigated and never successfully prosecuted. "You want me to marry a crime lord," she said. "I want you to honor a contract that will save 3,000 jobs and everything your grandfather spent his life building." She walked out of the study. She walked out of the house. She sat on the front steps for 40 minutes while her father waited inside, because she was 30 years old and sometimes you still needed to sit on the steps and be alone with a terrible decision. When she went back inside, she told him she'd go to Seoul. She told him she'd attend one meeting. She did not tell him she was already planning how to make herself so thoroughly unacceptable to the Seo family that they'd void the contract themselves and find another solution. She had 7 years of practice at being exactly who her family didn't want her to be. One more performance shouldn't be that hard. The Seo family sent a private jet. Of course they did. Nyla boarded it in the same clothes she'd worn to the meeting with her father. Black cargo pants, a cropped jacket, worn-in sneakers, her locks pulled back in a loose knot. She had a rolling carry-on and a case for her DJ equipment that she refused to check because she wasn't planning to stay long enough to need more than that, and she wasn't going anywhere without her gear. The flight attendant on the jet was young, professionally neutral, and very carefully did not react to Nyla's appearance. Nyla noticed the effort and respected it. Seoul in November was gray and cold and enormous, the skyline pressing against low cloud as the car sent by the Seo family moved through traffic from the airport. She'd been given a driver and no information about the schedule beyond a time and an address for what her father's lawyers had described as a family introduction meeting. She used the drive to change into the outfit she'd planned. The car had tinted windows. She worked fast, changing in the back seat with practiced efficiency, the result of years of quick costume swaps in club green rooms. When she was done, she looked at herself in the compact mirror from her bag and felt a grim satisfaction. The dress was red, very red. It had originally been a stage piece, designed for a rooftop festival set she'd done in Miami the previous summer. Short, structured, with cutouts at the sides that were technically tasteful, but only barely. She'd paired it with thigh-high boots and jewelry that was more statement than elegance. She'd left her locks loose so they fell around her shoulders in a way she knew would read as deliberately casual to people who expected formality. She looked like what she was, a nightclub DJ from Chicago who had no interest in being here. She walked into the CO family's meeting venue looking like exactly that. The venue was a private reception hall in a building that had no exterior signage. Inside it was understated and immaculate, dark wood panels, low lighting, floral arrangements that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Waiting staff stood at intervals around the room. A long table had been set with enough place settings for 12. There were already people present when she arrived. Her father's legal representative on one side of the room, looking immediately pained when he saw her outfit. On the other side, 4 men in dark suits who did not visibly react to anything. And at the head of the table, standing, was the most elegantly composed woman Nyla had ever encountered in person. Madame Seo Hye-jin. She was somewhere in her early 60s, dressed in a charcoal ensemble that was probably Korean couture. Her posture was architectural. Her expression, as she looked across the room at Nyla, was one of calm, complete assessment. The look of someone who had spent decades reading people and no longer needed more than a few seconds to do it. Nyla met her eyes and didn't blink. The madam crossed the room toward her. The staff parted. Her shoes made no sound on the stone floor. She stopped 2 feet away from Nyla and looked at her. Not down at her, not with obvious judgment, but with a directness that felt almost surgical. "You dressed this way on purpose," Madame Seo said. Her English was precise and almost unaccented. "I dressed like myself," Nyla said. The sound wasn't dismissive. It was something closer to amused, though the expression didn't change. "Your grandfather dressed unusually, too. He wore a Detroit Tigers cap to the first meeting he ever had with my late husband. My husband found it offensive. I found it honest." She tilted her head slightly. "Please sit down, Ms. Brooks. We have a great deal to discuss." Nyla had prepared herself for offense, for dismissal, for the polite but clear communication that she was not what the family had in mind. She had not prepared herself for a woman who simply absorbed her rebellion and kept moving. She sat down. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Nyla knew 2 things with certainty. The CO family had enough leverage to dismantle Brooks International without breaking a sweat, and Madame Seo had no intention of voiding the contract. The older woman spoke about the marriage as a settled matter, as though the only remaining details were administrative. She was never unkind. She was never warm. She was simply immovable, in the way that large and ancient things are immovable, not through force, but through permanence. When Nyla walked out of the building at the end of it, the cold air hit her bare arms and she stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed. Her phone buzzed. Her best friend Jade, back in Chicago, had sent a string of texts asking for updates. She typed back, "Weddings in 6 weeks, in Seoul. Don't ask." Jade sent back 12 question marks and then a voice note that Nyla didn't listen to until much later. She booked a hotel room and spent the next week in Seoul doing nothing useful. She tried twice more to find grounds for contesting the contract. Her father's lawyers told her the same thing both times. The provision was legally enforceable under the terms both families had agreed to, and any challenge would take longer than Brooks International had left. She called her father and told him she'd do it. She kept her voice very steady. She hung up before he could thank her. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of December. The venue was a private estate outside Seoul, not a church or a public hall, but the Seo family's own grounds, walled and gated, accessible only by a private road that Nyla's car had to pass through 2 security checkpoints to reach. The grounds themselves were extraordinary, stone walkways and bare winter gardens, and structures that looked like they'd been standing for centuries. Heat lamps had been placed at intervals to cut the cold. Everything was immaculate and everything was controlled. And the number of suited figures she counted near the perimeter told her that most of the security wasn't decorative. The guest list was somewhere around 200. She recognized 3 Korean cabinet members from photos she'd seen online during her research. She saw CEO names she recognized from the business sections of international newspapers. She saw other people she couldn't identify, but whose presence she understood, the way you understood a word in a language you didn't speak, from context, from the weight it carried. Nyla wore white. She had chosen the dress herself, paid for it herself, a long gown with a draped neckline that was beautiful without being performative. Jade had flown in to do her hair. Standing in the prep room beforehand with Jade working on her locks and not talking because she knew when Nyla didn't want to be talked to, Nyla had stared at herself in the mirror and tried to locate what she was feeling underneath the numbness. She found anger, she found grief, a diffuse grief, for the life she'd built that now had this enormous thing fastened to it. She found something that surprised her, which was a thin, stubborn thread of curiosity, and she hated that she found it because it made it harder to feel only righteous. "You look incredible," Jade said, because she said it the way other people breathed, instinctively, genuinely, without calculation. "I look like a woman who got sold," Nyla said. Jade met her eyes in the mirror. "You look like a woman who makes her own choices, even the ones that got forced on her." Nyla didn't have a response to that. The ceremony was formal and brief and conducted primarily in Korean, with portions translated for the benefit of the Brooks family representatives. Nyla stood at the center of it and went through the motions with the controlled precision of someone who had learned long ago how to be present in her body while her mind was somewhere else entirely. She answered when she was supposed to answer. She signed what she was supposed to sign. The groom was not present. This was not, she was told beforehand, unusual. This was not, she was told, intended as an insult. There were reasons, her father's liaison explained, practical and security related, and the CO family's legal team had filed all necessary documentation to ensure the marriage's validity regardless of physical presence at the ceremony. She had nodded and accepted this with the same expression she'd been wearing for 6 weeks. Standing at the altar of an estate in Seoul in December, marrying a man she'd never met and who hadn't bothered to show up, Nyla thought, "This is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me." And she had played a 3-hour set during a hurricane warning once. After the ceremony, there was food, there was carefully modulated conversation, and there were people she would probably never see again looking at her with an interest she didn't know how to read. Madame Seo moved through the reception with the same composure she'd displayed in every interaction Nyla had observed, unhurried, gravitational, leaving order in her wake. At a certain point, she appeared at Nyla's elbow and said quietly, "It's time." The car that took them from the reception to the Seo family estate was a large vehicle with blacked-out windows and a driver who Nyla had already identified as someone whose primary job was not driving. The route took 40 minutes. Nyla watched the city give way to suburbs and then to something that felt more removed. Larger properties, higher walls, a road that eventually became private in a way that was communicated by what wasn't there. No other cars, no pedestrians, no commercial anything. The compound. She'd heard it referred to this way in enough conversations by now that the word had lost its strangeness. But entering it for the first time, passing through a gate that operated on some signal she couldn't identify, the gate swinging open as though the building itself recognized the car, she felt the strangeness return. It was large. That was the first thing. Not a house in the way she thought of houses, but a structure of connected buildings arranged around a central courtyard, traditional architecture in some elements and modern in others, the whole thing sitting on grounds that were lit with careful, even precision. There were people visible at the edges, staff, security, the distinction between them blurry. Madame Seo walked with her through the entrance and across the central courtyard without speaking. Nyla had stopped expecting explanations. She walked beside the older woman and watched the compound around her and waited. They reached a building at the far end of the courtyard. The main residence, she understood, though the compound had several structures that could have qualified. Inside, a corridor, more controlled light, the quiet of a building that was heavily insulated from everything outside its walls. They stopped at a set of double doors. Madame Seo paused. For the first time, Nyla saw something in the older woman's expression that might have been emotion, something that moved behind her composure without quite breaking it. "My son," she said. "He is difficult." A beat. "He has good reasons for most of it. I want you to know that." It was the most personal thing she'd said to Nyla in 6 weeks of interactions. Before Nyla could respond, the doors opened from inside. The room beyond was the study. Bookshelves, a desk, a fireplace that was doing actual work against the December cold. Low light. The smell of wood smoke and something faintly antiseptic underneath it that Nyla clocked and filed away without understanding why. He was by the window, not standing. Sitting. in a wheelchair, positioned so that the low light from the window fell across him at an angle that was either deliberate or coincidentally cinematic. He was dressed in black, a suit that had clearly been made for his body, tailored down to the last millimeter. His hands rested on the arms of the wheelchair with a stillness that felt controlled rather than relaxed. He was looking at her. He was, objectively, one of the best-looking men she'd ever seen. She registered this the way you registered information you intended to be useless. Stored it, set it aside, moved on. "This is Seo Kang-jae," Madame Seo said, "the man you just married." Kang-jae said nothing. He was still looking at her. His expression was unreadable in a way that was different from his mother's. Where Madame Seo's composure felt like discipline, his felt like distance, like he was watching from somewhere further away than the room suggested. She understood, in the silence that followed, what she hadn't understood before. She'd spent 6 weeks building theories about why a family like the Seo family needed an arranged marriage, what leverage or strategy or dynastic logic was driving it. The answer, looking at Kang-jae in his chair, with the stillness he wore around himself like armor, was simpler and heavier than any of her theories. The heir to one of Asia's largest criminal organizations could not walk. And someone, maybe multiple someones, needed to be very sure that no one outside a closed circle knew the full extent of what that meant. She kept her face neutral. She was good at keeping her face neutral. Kang-jae was watching her do it. She could tell he was cataloging her reaction with the same precision she'd used on him, reading her the way she was reading him. She had a sudden sense that being underestimated by this man would be both easy and extremely inadvisable. "Ms. Brooks," he said. His English was excellent and almost entirely without warmth. "I should tell you at the outset that this arrangement was not my preference." "Mine either," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "Not much. Enough." "Sit down," he said. "We should discuss the terms of your residency here." She noticed he said residency. Not life. Not marriage. Residency. Like she was a tenant. Like this was administrative. She pulled a chair from against the wall, set it where she wanted it, rather than where the geography of the room suggested it should go, and sat down. "I'm listening," she said. He told her the rules. There were more of them than she'd expected, and most of them were framed as security protocols rather than restrictions. She would notify the household in advance of any planned excursions. Her phone and devices would be assessed by the family's security team. She would attend certain functions as required, for appearances, but would otherwise be left to manage her own time as she chose. She would not discuss the family's business with anyone outside the compound. She would not contact journalists, investigators, or anyone with a professional interest in the Seo family's affairs. She let him finish. "And what do I get?" she said. He blinked. It was so quick she almost missed it. "Excuse me. You've given me a list of restrictions. I want to know what I receive in exchange for complying with them. The contract was presented to me as an exchange. The Seo family absorbs Brooks International's debt and restructures the company. I want to know the timeline and the terms of that specifically." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached for a folder on the desk beside him. She noticed the way he moved when he did it, the precise economy of it, no wasted motion, and slid it across toward her. "All of it is in there," he said. "The timeline, the terms, the conditions. Our legal team can answer any specific questions." She picked it up. "I'll read it tonight." "Good." She stood. She tucked the folder under her arm. "One more thing." He waited. "I DJ," she said. "I have for 7 years. It's my career. I'm not stopping because of this arrangement." The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long, but it was a heavy 2 seconds. "That's not—" He stopped, restarted. "The security implications of regular public appearances—" "I'm not negotiating," she said. "You told me your restrictions. I'm telling you mine. I keep my career. Your security team can figure out how to accommodate it." He was looking at her with that same measuring expression, and she held it without blinking, because she had learned a long time ago that the first time you looked away from a man like this was the last time you got to choose where the line was. "We'll discuss it," he said. "Later." "Sure," she said. She said it in the tone that meant, "I've already decided." She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "Where's my room?" "Someone will show you." He'd already turned back toward the window. "Good night, Miss Brooks." Nyla, she said, because if she was going to live in this place, she was going to be called by her actual name. Good night. She walked out into the corridor and stood there for a moment in the quiet of the compound's interior, listening to the silence. No bass, no crowd, no 400 bodies moving in unison to a frequency she controlled. Just the distant sound of wind against walls that had probably stood longer than her entire family's history in America. A young woman in a gray uniform appeared from a side door and inclined her head. "This way, please." Nyla followed her. Her room was large and cold and beautifully appointed, with a window that looked out over the dark courtyard. Her luggage had been brought ahead of her. Her equipment case sat beside the wardrobe, still intact, still sealed. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the folder King Jay had given her and read every page of it. She read it twice. The terms were there, as he'd said. The debt acquisition, the restructuring timeline, everything her father had promised her. All of it laid out in language designed to be unambiguous. The CO family would save Brooks International, and she would stay here, in this compound, married to a man in a wheelchair who had looked at her like she was a problem he was calculating how to solve. She set the folder down and looked at the ceiling. She had told her father she would fix this. She had fixed it. The cost was her freedom, or some specific version of it, and she was going to have to figure out what was left of herself inside the walls of a compound in Seoul in the middle of winter. She picked up her phone and texted Jade. Arrived. Alive. The husband didn't come to his own wedding, and then I met him for the first time, and I genuinely cannot tell if he hates me specifically or everyone in general. Jade wrote back, "That's insane. Are you okay?" She thought about it. "No," she typed, "but I will be." She turned the light off and lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside and the silence inside, and somewhere in the compound, far away, the muffled sound of something she couldn't identify. A voice, maybe, or a door, or nothing at all. In the morning, she would wake up in the house of a man she didn't know who had rules she hadn't agreed to in a world she hadn't chosen. But somewhere beneath the numbness and the anger and the exhaustion, that thin thread of curiosity was still there, and she still hated it, and she still couldn't cut it loose. What was he really, behind the chair, and the distance, and the measured words? What had broken him? And why, in the moment she'd told him she wasn't negotiating, had his expression done something so small and so fast that she would have missed it if she hadn't been looking? Something that looked, impossibly, like respect? She closed her eyes. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and strange, and in it she heard a sound she couldn't locate. Not music exactly, but something with rhythm, something moving through the walls of the compound in the dark, too distant to identify, too deliberate to be random. She woke at 4 a.m. with her hand pressed flat against the wall beside the bed, as though she'd been trying to follow it, and the sound was gone, and the compound was silent, and somewhere in this building was a man who had not chosen her any more than she had chosen him, who was carrying something heavy that she had not yet been given the shape of. She lay still and listened to the silence until morning came. The compound had its own rhythm. Nyla learned this in the first week, not because anyone told her, but because she was a person who had spent 7 years reading rooms, reading crowds, understanding the invisible structure underneath the noise. Every space had a pulse. Club Meridian had one. The Brooks family home in Westchester had one. And the CO compound had one that was unlike anything she'd encountered before. Controlled, layered, and underneath the control, tightly wound. Staff moved through the corridors on schedules she couldn't see but could feel. Security rotations happened at intervals that were irregular enough to be deliberate. Doors opened and closed with a precision that told her someone was always watching something. The compound wasn't just a home. It was an operation, and everyone inside it was part of it, and she was the only person present who hadn't been briefed on the protocol. She spent the first 3 days learning the layout, not because anyone gave her a map, no one did, but because she walked. She woke early, and she walked the corridors and the courtyard and the covered walkways between buildings, and she cataloged what she saw the same way she cataloged a new venue before a set: exits, acoustics, the way sound moved, and where it got swallowed. She didn't see Kang Jae. She saw evidence of him. A corridor on the east side of the main building that staff didn't walk through without a specific reason. A room at the end of it, with a closed door that had a different quality of silence around it than the other closed doors. She saw the way household staff oriented themselves slightly differently when they passed that corridor, the way people orient toward a gravitational center without realizing they're doing it. She didn't go down that corridor. Not yet. On the fourth morning, she found the kitchen at 6 a.m. and made herself coffee using equipment that was unfamiliar and European and required 3 attempts to operate correctly. She was standing at the counter drinking it when a woman she hadn't seen before came in and stopped. The woman was about 60, built solidly, with close-cropped gray hair and an expression that communicated professional neutrality so thoroughly it looped back around to personality. She looked at Nyla. She looked at the coffee equipment. She looked at the counter, where Nyla had made a modest mess in the process of figuring out the machine. "I can show you how it works," the woman said, in careful English. "I figured it out," Nyla said. The woman moved to the counter and began straightening things with the efficient affection of someone who cared about a space without being precious about it. "I'm Mrs. Hahn. I manage the household." "Nyla, I know who you are. Not unkind, just accurate. Is there anything you need that you haven't found?" "A gym." Mrs. Hahn blinked. It was the first unrehearsed reaction Nyla had gotten from anyone in the compound. "There's a fitness room, east building, lower level. I'll have someone show you." "I'll find it." Mrs. Hahn looked at her for a moment with an expression Nyla couldn't fully read. Something between assessment and something warmer that hadn't decided yet whether to show itself. "Breakfast is at 8, Mrs. Hahn said. "The family dining room. Madame Seo expects—" "I'll be there," Nyla said. She found the gym herself. It was well-equipped and empty at that hour, and she spent 90 minutes in it doing the kind of workout that was less about fitness and more about having something to hit. There was a heavy bag in the corner. She used it until her knuckles were sore through the wraps she'd found in a supply cabinet, and then she stood in the center of the room breathing hard with her hands on her knees, and she felt marginally more like herself. Breakfast was formal in a way that felt structural rather than performed. A long table in a room with tall windows that let in the flat December light, 2 place settings. Madame Seo already seated when Nyla arrived. The older woman was reading from a tablet and drinking tea, and she set both down when Nyla came in without making a production of it. They ate. Madame Seo asked questions, not personal ones, not yet, but questions about Brooks International's operations, about specific divisions, about Nyla's grandfather's original business model. It became clear within the first 10 minutes that Madame Seo knew a great deal about the Brooks family's company, and was not asking out of ignorance but out of something else, verification maybe, or a desire to understand how Nyla's mind worked when she talked about something she actually cared about. Nyla answered honestly because she didn't see a reason not to, and because talking about her grandfather's company was one of the few things that still made her feel connected to why she'd agreed to any of this. Kang Jae did not appear at breakfast, or lunch, or the formal dinner that second evening, which Nyla attended in clothes that were a deliberate step up from her first day's outfit. Not because she was conceding anything, but because she'd decided that dressing for combat and dressing with intention were 2 different things, and she was capable of both. She saw him on the 5th day. She was crossing the central courtyard in the early afternoon, moving from the east building back to the main residence, when she heard wheels on stone behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She registered the sound, identified it, kept walking for 2 more steps before she stopped and turned around. He was moving across the courtyard from the opposite direction. He saw her at the same moment she turned. Neither of them had been expecting this. She could tell from the way he stopped, the slight recalibration in his expression. He was wearing dark clothes, no jacket, which struck her as insufficiently dressed for the temperature. There was a folder in his lap and a phone in one hand. He looked like a man who had been going somewhere specific and was now deciding whether this interruption changed anything. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Nyla," she said again. A muscle in his jaw moved. "Nyla, you missed breakfast both days I've been here. I don't eat breakfast with guests." "I'm not a guest." She held his gaze. "That's the whole point of this arrangement, isn't it? I'm not a guest." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the study on the first night. That measuring quality, reading her the way you read something written in a language you're fluent in but still have to think about. "I have work," he said. "So do I," she said. "I want to talk about my equipment." My DJ equipment. I need to set it up somewhere in this compound. I need space, and I need an adequate power supply, and I need to know your security team's parameters for me performing outside the compound, because I have a residency at a club in Chicago that I need to manage remotely and eventually return to in person. He stared at her. She waited. You've been here 5 days, he said. I'm aware. You're negotiating residency terms on the 5th day. I negotiated them on the 1st day. You said we'd discuss it later. It's later. The folder in his lap shifted. His hand tightened on the phone briefly, then relaxed. Come to my office, he said. 4 o'clock. I'll be there, she said. She was there at 3:58 because she was always early to everything, because being early was a form of control she'd maintained since she was 19 years old and had shown up late to a set and never forgiven herself for it. His office in the main residence was different from the study where they'd first met. Larger, more functional, dominated by a desk with multiple monitors and walls that were partly bookshelves and partly something else. Maps, she realized. Large, detailed maps of Seoul and other cities with markings that she made herself not read too carefully. There were 2 other men in the room when she arrived, and they left without being asked, which told her he'd known she was early and had cleared the room for her, which told her something about his attention she filed away and didn't comment on. And he was behind the desk. No folder this time. He was watching her look at the maps, and he didn't tell her to stop looking. The club, he said. Which one? Meridian, Chicago. I've had a monthly residency there for 4 years. It's my primary professional income, and it's how I've built my audience. Your audience. He said it without inflection. 60,000 followers on my DJ page alone. More across my other accounts. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not famous, but I'm established. I have a career, and I need you to understand that this arrangement does not include me erasing it. I understand that, he said. What I'm telling you is that regular public appearances create security concerns that require management. You cannot simply... I know I can't simply anything, she said. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for a structure that works for both of us. Give me 1 room in this compound with a proper setup, and I can manage most of my remote work from here. For in-person appearances, your team tells me the parameters and I work within them. I've been managing difficult logistics since I was 22. I'm not going to blow up your security operation. He was quiet for a moment. Why DJ-ing? He said. The question landed differently than she expected. Not dismissive, genuinely asking. Because it's the one thing that's completely mine, she said, before she'd decided to say it. I didn't inherit it. I didn't build it with family money. I started with a second-hand controller in a studio apartment, and I learned it in the dark, and it belongs to me in a way that nothing else ever has. The office was quiet. One of the monitors on his desk showed a scrolling feed of something she couldn't read from this angle. There's a room on the 3rd floor of the East Building, he said. It was used as a music room at one point. It's been empty for years. Mrs. Han can arrange for whatever you need in terms of power infrastructure. He looked at the desk. For external appearances, my head of security will contact you. His name is Ji-ho. He's thorough. Work with him, and he'll work with you. She didn't say thank you, because it wasn't a favor. It was an accommodation that cost him nothing and had been reasonable from the beginning. Okay, she said. She stood. One more thing, he said. She stopped. Your outfits. He said it the way you said something you'd been deciding whether to say. When you perform. The photographs I've seen of your performances. No, she said. He looked up from the desk. Whatever you're about to say about my outfits when I perform, she said. The answer is no. That's not something you get to have an opinion about. The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous silences. Warmer, almost. More friction in it. I was going to say, he said carefully, that if you're going to have a public profile while living in this compound, the security team will need to be briefed on the specific venues in advance. The outfits are relevant to the briefing in terms of how visible you are. She looked at him. He looked at her. Fine, she said. Tell Ji-ho. She left. She set up her equipment in the 3rd floor room over the following 2 days with help from a young compound staff member named Dai Jung, who turned out to be genuinely curious about music production in a way that made him useful rather than just polite. She got her set up working on the 2nd afternoon and stood in the room with the winter light coming through the window and played a mix for the first time in 12 days. and felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't realized was knotted. She started working again, remotely managing her Chicago bookings, working on a new mix series, staying in contact with her manager and with Jade, and with the life she'd built that was now somehow coexisting with this other thing she'd been handed. Kang Jae, she learned through proximity rather than conversation, worked constantly. She heard his voice sometimes from the corridor, in Korean, quick and precise, the tone of someone issuing instructions rather than making requests. She saw him twice more in the first 2 weeks, once crossing the courtyard again, and once at a dinner that Madame So had arranged with guests from outside the compound, at which he appeared at the table on time, immaculate, and spent the evening navigating political and financial conversation with a fluency that made her understand in a new way what the word power actually looked like when it wasn't performing itself. He was capable in the way that dangerous things were capable, not by showing what they could do, but by the quality of stillness they maintained when they weren't doing it. She caught him watching her twice during that dinner. Both times he looked away before she could respond. Both times she felt the look afterward, the way you felt a draft after a door had been opened and closed. The first real fight happened in the 3rd week. She'd come back from a run. Jiho had approved a route along the compound's perimeter road, which was enclosed and thus manageable from a security standpoint, and she'd been using it in the mornings, and walked into the main building to find 2 men she didn't recognize sitting in the entrance hall with the specific stillness of people waiting for something. She moved past them to the corridor toward her wing and found Mrs. Han coming in the opposite direction with an expression that was controlled in a way that meant something was happening. "What's going on?" Nyla said. "Nothing that concerns Mrs. Han." The older woman looked at her. "Representatives from an external family," she said carefully, "arrived unscheduled. Madame Seo is managing." "Where's Kang Jae?" "In his office." Neela went to the east corridor without deciding to. She knocked on the office door and opened it before anyone answered, which she registered was aggressive but didn't stop. He was on the phone. He looked up when she came in with an expression that was several things at once, none of them welcoming. She waited. He said something in Korean into the phone, short and final, and lowered it. "You don't knock," he said. "I knocked." "You knocked and then immediately opened the door, which means you didn't knock. There are 2 men in your entrance hall who weren't here this morning, and your head housekeeper is managing her expression in a way that means something is wrong," Nyla said. "I want to know if I'm in a building that's about to become a problem." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. The recalibration of someone encountering something they'd estimated differently. "You're not in danger," he said. "That's not what I asked. That's the only answer I'm giving you." He set the phone down. "Go to your room, Neela." "No." The word landed between them like something struck. She watched him process it. The absolute refusal, stated without heat, without apology, without any of the deference he was accustomed to receiving in his own building from everyone around him. "This is my home," he said, and the word home came out with an edge she hadn't heard from him before, something compressed under the control. "It is," she said. "Mine too. According to every document I've signed in the last 6 weeks." He stared at her. "Tell me what's happening," she said, "or I'll go ask those men in the hall myself." "You will not." "I will. I've walked into harder rooms than your entrance hall." He exhaled through his nose. It was the closest thing to losing composure she'd seen from him yet, and it was very small, and she noted it with the precision she noted everything. "It's a negotiation," he said. "Another organization disputing a territorial arrangement. It doesn't involve you, and it will be resolved today." "Is anyone going to get hurt?" The question surprised him. She could see it, the slight shift, the recalibration again. "No," he said. "Not today." She stood in his office for another moment, looking at him, and then she turned and walked out. She didn't go to her room. She went to the music room and put on headphones and worked, and she felt his answer settling in her chest alongside the understanding that there were layers to this compound and this marriage and this man that she hadn't started to reach yet. And she didn't know whether that knowledge frightened her or simply demanded her attention the way complicated things always demanded her attention. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in her room listening to the compound, and at some point, past midnight, the building at its quietest, she heard it again. The sound she'd heard her first night. Closer now, or maybe she was more attuned to it, a rhythmic impact, deep and repetitive, coming from somewhere below her in the east wing. Not music, not mechanical, something physical, something being hit repeatedly with force. She got up. She followed the sound in her socks down 2 flights of stairs and into the lower level of the east building, past the gym she'd been using, to a room further along the corridor that she hadn't investigated because the door had always been closed. It was closed now, but the sound was coming from behind it. Clearer now, a heavy rhythmic impact, and underneath it, breathing. Controlled breathing, but strained, the way breathing got when the body was being pushed. She stood in the corridor with her hand raised to knock and didn't knock. She stood there for a full minute, listening. Then she went back upstairs. She lay in the dark and put together what she'd heard with what she'd seen, and the picture that assembled itself was one she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with yet. A man who needed a wheelchair for the public world of meetings and courtyard crossings and formal dinners. A man who came down to a private room in the middle of the night and pushed his body past its limits in the dark where no one could see. She stared at the ceiling and felt the thread of curiosity pull tighter. 3 days later, Kang Jae told her at dinner, one of the rare evenings when he appeared at the family table, that her first approved external appearance had been scheduled. A private event. A charity gala with a curated guest list. Jiho had vetted it. She would perform a 90-minute set. "Fine," she said. "You'll be accompanied." "I know, Jiho told me." He looked at her across the table. "You talked to Jiho directly." "You told me to work with him." "I worked with him." Madame Seo was watching them both with an expression of someone attending a performance she'd specifically arranged. "Your outfit," Kang Jae said, and stopped. "My outfit is already decided," Nyla said. "I wasn't going to—" "Good. I was going to say," he said, with deliberate patience that had an edge under it, "that you should take a coat. It's cold." Nyla looked at him. He looked back. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, which was worse somehow than if she hadn't meant it, and she could tell from the slight change in his expression that he felt the shift too, the slight wrongness of sincerity breaking through the pattern of their exchanges. She performed the gala set, and it was fine. A good room, a receptive crowd, Jiho and 2 others positioned around the perimeter with the low-key competence of people who were very good at being invisible. She played 93 minutes because the crowd deserved the extra 3, and she came off the stage with the particular exhaustion that was actually just all the other exhaustion pouring out once she had an outlet. In the car back to the compound, Jiho said, "You're very good." She looked at him. He was staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Thank you," she said. "He asked me," Jiho said, "to watch the crowd's reaction, not the security situation, the crowd's reaction to you specifically." She absorbed that. "What will you tell him?" she said. Jiho's expression didn't change. That the crowd was engaged, that you controlled the room completely, that you know what you're doing. She looked out the window at the city going past. She thought about a man she was married to who hadn't come to his own wedding, who watched her across dinner tables with an expression she couldn't fully read, who sent his security chief to watch how a crowd responded to her and called it a briefing requirement. She thought about a sound in the dark, coming through a closed door, and breathing that was pushed to its limit, and someone working alone in a space no one else was supposed to see. When they got back to the compound, it was past midnight, and the building was quiet. She came through the main entrance and moved toward the corridor to her wing and stopped. Kang Jae was in the entrance hall, not passing through. Sitting in his chair near the far wall, a book open in his lap, which she didn't believe for a second because the book was at the wrong angle for actual reading. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he said. His voice was different. She couldn't immediately identify how, not softer exactly, but less defended. "Good," she said. The room was good. "Jiho will send his report tomorrow." "I know." She stood in the entrance hall looking at him, looking at her, and the compound was quiet around them, and she thought, "This is the strangest situation I have ever been in." And also, he waited up. He had waited up. "Good night, Kang Jae," she said. Something moved across his face. Small. Fast. The expression he made when something surprised him, which was becoming a thing she recognized and cataloged. "Good night," he said. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed, and thought about the way he'd said her name the one time she'd made him use it, and the way he'd been sitting in the entrance hall with a book he wasn't reading, and the sound through the closed door at midnight, and the years of distance in his eyes that was different from coldness, that was actually, she was starting to understand, the look of someone who had been badly, specifically, and carefully hurt. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed. Jade, you good? She looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed, I don't know yet. She set the phone down and lay back on the bed with her arm over her eyes. And outside the compound, the city of Seoul moved through its night. And inside the compound, something was slowly, and without either of them quite choosing it, beginning to shift. And 3 nights later, she would hear him through a different door. Not the gym this time, but his study. And the sound wouldn't be impact and controlled breath, but something else entirely. Something that sounded like a voice breaking. A man talking in his sleep in Korean. A name said over and over with the kind of anguish that didn't need translation. And she would stand in the corridor with her hand pressed flat on the door and understand, fully and finally, that the weight Seo Kang-jae carried, the name he said in his sleep, was Ha-Yoon. Nyla didn't know that yet. Didn't know the name, didn't know the shape of what it carried. But she stood in the corridor outside his study at 2 a.m. with her palm flat against the door and felt the sound of it move through the wood and into her hand like a current. 2 syllables, repeated. Sometimes a question. Sometimes something that wasn't a question at all, but a sound a person made when they were being pulled under. She stood there until it stopped. Then she went back to her room and lay in the dark and didn't sleep. And in the morning she came down to breakfast, and Madame Seo was already at the table and looked at her across the rim of her teacup with an expression that said, I know you heard something. I'm not going to explain it yet. Nyla poured her coffee and sat down and said nothing, because she was learning that in this compound, timing was everything, and asking too early was the same as not asking at all. She waited. It was another 4 days before the fever came. She heard it first from Mrs. Han, a brief, carefully worded mention that Mr. Seo would not be at dinner, that he was resting, delivered in the tone people used when they were describing something more serious than the words they were using. Nyla nodded and ate dinner with Madame Seo and watched the older woman's face for information the way she'd learned to watch everything in this compound. And what she saw there was controlled worry, which was the most frightening kind. She went to the east corridor after dinner. She knocked on his study door. No answer. She tried the adjacent room, a smaller sitting room she'd seen him use twice, and found it empty. She stood in the corridor and listened and heard, from further down, a sound that didn't belong to the compound's usual register, uneven breathing, the particular rhythm of a body fighting itself. His bedroom door was ajar. She pushed it open. The room was dark except for one lamp in the corner, throwing low amber light across a space that was spare, and ordered in the way that spaces were ordered by people who needed control over their physical environment, because other things were uncontrollable. He was in the bed, not sleeping. His eyes were half open, tracking toward her when she came in with the unfocused quality of someone whose fever had gotten ahead of them. His face was damp. The blanket was pulled up to his chest, and he'd clearly been fighting with it. She crossed the room and put her hand on his forehead without asking, because asking would have taken time she didn't want to waste. He was burning. How long? She said. He looked at her. His jaw was tight. You shouldn't be in here. How long have you had the fever? Since this afternoon. He said it through teeth that wanted to clench against the discomfort. It passes. It always passes. Has someone called a doctor? I don't need... That's not what I asked. She straightened and looked around the room. Where does Mrs. Han keep medical supplies? Nyla. Her name in his mouth, this time, had a different weight than it had carried before. Something scraped in it, something that the fever had gotten to. I don't need a doctor. Fine. Then you'll let me handle it. She found the bathroom attached to the bedroom and located a medicine cabinet that was stocked with a specificity that told her someone had put thought into it. She found what she needed, ran cold water over a cloth, came back. He watched her do all of this with an expression she would have called resentful if there wasn't something else layered under it, something closer to the look of a person who hadn't been taken care of in a long time and didn't know where to put the feeling. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the cloth to his forehead, and he let her, which she understood was the most unguarded thing he'd done since she arrived. He didn't sleep. She didn't either. She stayed. Not because she'd decided to in any formal sense, but because leaving felt like the wrong thing, and she'd learned to trust the feeling of wrong when it was this clear. She brought water and made him drink it. She replaced the cloth when it warmed. She sat in the chair she'd pulled to beside the bed and watched the fever work through him and come down by degrees, and at some point around 4 a.m., he stopped fighting whatever he was fighting and drifted into something that was closer to real sleep. But before that, in the difficult middle hours, when the fever was still high enough to thin the walls between what a person would say and what they actually thought, he talked. Not to her, not directly. He talked the way people talked when they were half somewhere else, words coming loose from whatever usually held them in place. In Korean mostly, but Korean that broke into English sometimes in a way that suggested his mind moved between languages without marking the transitions. She caught fragments. She caught the name again. Ha-Yun, said with a specific anguish that had clearly been living in him so long it had worn a groove. She caught, I should have seen it coming. She caught, it should have been me. She caught once in English, very clearly. I can't feel my legs, said in a voice she'd never heard from him before. The voice under all the other voices. The voice that predated the control and the distance and the measured words. The voice of someone in the immediate aftermath of something catastrophic. She sat in the dark and listened and didn't move. By morning, the fever had broken. He woke to find her still in the chair beside his bed, and the expression that crossed his face when he registered her there was something she didn't have an exact name for. Complicated and quick and almost immediately buried. You stayed, he said. Yes. He looked at the ceiling. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and deliberate, the words chosen like they were being placed somewhere he could take them back from if he needed to. There was a woman, he said. Her name was Yoon Ha-Yoon. She was... He stopped. We were together for 3 years. I believed I would marry her. Nyla didn't speak. She held still the way you held still when something was coming toward you that required your complete attention. 4 years ago, he said, there was an explosion, a car bombing targeted at me. Ha-Yun was in the vehicle instead. He paused. The pause was long enough that she heard the compound silence pressing in around it. She died. That was what I was told. That was what everyone believed. He stopped again. The explosion didn't kill me, he said, but it ended my ability to walk. A beat. Or so I allowed everyone to believe. She processed that, filed it, let him finish. The rehabilitation, he said, was private. Years of it. 3 other people in the world knew the true extent of my recovery. My mother, Jiho. My personal physician. He looked at her for the first time since beginning to speak. I told you this arrangement had strategic dimensions. The wheelchair was one of them. An enemy who believes you're permanently disabled calculates differently than an enemy who knows you're not. Nyla looked at him for a long moment. How much can you do? She said. Walk. Actually walk. Enough, he said. It was December when she'd arrived. Now it was moving toward the end of January, and the compound grounds had a thin layer of frost on the stones in the mornings that made the courtyard look like something out of a different era. Christmas had come and gone. Her friends in Chicago had mailed a package that included a small tree that foldable into a box, a string of LED lights, and a card signed by the entire Meridian staff. And she'd set it up in the music room and felt the particular ache of things that were good in the wrong context. Kang Jae had seen it when he passed the open door. He'd stopped. He hadn't said anything, but he'd stopped for long enough that she'd registered it, and later that night she'd heard, from somewhere else in the building, the sound of something that might have been music. Not her music, not the pulsing electronic architecture she worked in, but something older and quieter that she couldn't identify through the walls. She'd stood in the hallway outside the music room and listened and not moved. Things were different after the fever night. Not dramatically. No declarations, no sudden warmth, nothing that would have been visible to anyone watching from the outside. But the architecture of their interactions had shifted in some structural way. He began appearing at breakfast intermittently. He stopped prefacing every conversation with the implicit reminder that she was a guest. Once, crossing paths in the courtyard, he'd slowed and asked how the mix series she was working on was progressing, and the question had been specific enough that she'd understood he'd paid attention to something she'd mentioned in passing a week earlier, which meant he was listening with more care than he showed. She was also listening with more care than she showed. She was in the music room on the first Friday of February when Madame Seo appeared in the doorway, unusual because the older woman respected the space, and said, "I'd like you to come somewhere with me this week. Kang Jae's primary offices. I want you to understand how the organization functions." Nyla took off her headphones. "Why?" "Because you live inside it," Madame Seo said. "And you are not a person who tolerates not understanding her environment. I've been watching you map this compound since the day you arrived." A slight pause. "Also because I believe you can be useful to Kang Jae, and I want him to begin believing that too." "Useful how?" "Come and see," the older woman said. They went on Wednesday. The offices were in a building in one of Seoul's financial districts. The surface appearance was a private equity holding company, and the surface appearance was impeccably maintained. The building had 14 floors, and the kind of security that was thorough enough to be invisible. Madame Seo moved through it with the ease of someone who had built parts of it, which Nyla was beginning to understand was literally true. Kang Jae's floor was the 10th. She followed Madame Seo out of the elevator and into an anteroom where two assistants worked without looking up, and through a set of glass doors into a corridor that led to a corner office that she could see through a partially open door was large and orderly and occupied. She could see him at his desk, his back partially to the door, talking to someone. She could also see, standing on his side of the desk with her hand resting on his shoulder, a woman she had never seen before. Young, mid-20s maybe. Beautiful in a way that was architectural, precise, dressed with the kind of simplicity that was expensive. Her hand was on his shoulder with the familiarity of established intimacy, and she was leaning slightly toward him, and something she said made him turn his head, and in turning his head he saw, through the partially open door, Nyla standing in the corridor. His expression changed completely. Nyla had a half-second to read it. Not guilt, not what she'd expected, but something more complicated, something that had the quality of a locked door being rattled from inside. Before Madame Seo stepped forward and pushed the office door fully open and said, "We're here." The woman straightened. She turned. And when she turned and saw Madame Seo, her expression did something that Nyla's body registered before her mind caught up. A flicker of something. Not surprise. Calculation. The quick, specific recalibration of someone who had been mid-play when the board changed. "Madame Seo," she said. Her voice was warm. It was a performed warmth, and it was expertly done. "I didn't realize you were coming in today." "Evidently," Madame Seo said. The woman's eyes moved to Nyla. They stayed there for a beat that was one beat too long. "This is my son's wife," Madame Seo said. "Nyla." Something happened in the room. Nyla felt it the way she felt a room's energy change when a wrong track dropped, the way the whole thing shifted key in a single moment. The woman smiled. "Of course," she said. "I've heard." She extended her hand and Nyla shook it, and the woman's grip was exactly the right firmness, and her smile was exactly the right warmth, and every single thing about her was calibrated to be exactly right, which was how Nyla knew something was completely wrong. "I'm Ha-Yun," the woman said. "Yoon Ha-Yun." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Nyla did not look at Kang Jae. She looked at Ha-Yun, because Ha-Yun was where the information was, and what she saw in Ha-Yun's face in those 3 seconds, underneath the exact smile and the exact warmth, was something that had the specific shape of a person waiting for an explosion they'd set. She heard from behind her the sound of Kang Jae's wheelchair moving, then his voice, in Korean, very low, with a quality she'd never heard from him before, something stripped all the way down, past the control, past the distance, past everything she'd cataloged about him in 2 months of living in his compound and learning his register. A quality that sounded like a structure failing from the inside. Ha-Yun answered in Korean, still smiling. Madame Seo said nothing. She was watching her son. Nyla stood in the office doorway and understood that she was witnessing something that had been building for 4 years and had chosen this specific moment to surface, and that she was not peripheral to it. She was somehow the reason it had surfaced now. Ha-Yun had looked at her with calculation. Ha-Yun had waited for the explosion, which meant Ha-Yun had known she was coming today, which meant someone had told her, which meant, "You're not dead," Kang Jae said. In English. Deliberate, so Nyla could follow it. Ha-Yun's smile shifted by a fraction. No, she said. I'm not. The explosion was arranged, she said, simply. The way you said something you'd been carrying so long that the weight of it had become ordinary. I arranged it. Or rather, I told the people who arranged it where I would and wouldn't be. A pause. I'm sorry, Kang Jae. That's inadequate, I know. The room was completely silent. Nyla heard her own heartbeat. The money, Kang Jae said. His voice had gone flat in a way that was worse than any expression. The organizational intelligence that was leaked to the Huang Syndicate in 2021. The accounts that were compromised. Ha-eun didn't answer. The explosion was paid for, he said, by someone who needed what you had access to, and you gave it to them. Not a question. Still Ha-eun said nothing, and her silence was its own answer. How long, he said, before the bombing? How long were you working for them? Kang Jae, how long? Ha-eun looked at him with an expression that was the most honest thing Nyla had seen on her face since she walked in. Not remorse, something more complicated. Something that might have been, in another life, love, but had somewhere along the way made a transaction with something else and hadn't come back from it. A year, Ha-eun said. Before the bombing, a year. Kang Jae was very still. Madame Seo, beside Nyla, made a sound that wasn't a word, just a breath, released with a control that told Nyla she had suspected something like this, or maybe had known some version of it, and knowing it and hearing it confirmed were different weights. Then Ha-eun looked at Nyla, directly. With the calculation fully surfaced now, the smile reduced to something functional. You're very beautiful, Ha-eun said. He has good taste, or his mother does. She tilted her head. How much do you actually know about what you married into? Enough, Nyla said. Ha-eun took a step toward her. You know he was using the wheelchair as a strategy, that he walks now, that the disability that your family was presumably told about when this marriage was arranged was Ha-eun, Kang Jae's voice. One word stripped to its core. She stopped. She looked at him. And then she reached into the bag at her side and Nyla's body moved before her mind did. She stepped to the left and her hand came up and she wasn't sure what she was expecting, but what Ha-eun produced was not a weapon but a folder, which she dropped on the desk in front of Kang Jae. The accounts, Ha-eun said, the ones your mother has been building for the past 3 years in preparation for transitioning the organization's assets into legitimate holdings. The ones that would allow you to actually do what you've been planning, step back from the criminal structure, go legitimate, protect the family. She tapped the folder. I have copies, and I have people who will use them in ways that will make the last 4 years look manageable, unless we come to a different arrangement. The silence that came after that was a different kind of silence. Nyla looked at the folder on the desk. She looked at Ha-eun. She looked at Kang Jae, and what she saw on his face was something she understood with terrible clarity. The face of a man who had survived the bombing, survived the years of rehabilitation, survived building a cover from the wreckage of his own body, survived his grief and his planning and his careful construction of a path forward, and who was now looking at the specific person who had destroyed all of it the first time, standing in his office, holding the second detonator. Ha-eun's eyes moved back to Nyla with that look she'd been carrying since the introduction. Specific, territorial. The look of someone who had come here today not just for leverage, but for something more personal, and who had found, in the form of a woman she hadn't expected, something she hadn't calculated for. Leave, Ha-eun said to Nyla. This is a family matter. She stays, Kang Jae said. Ha-eun looked at him. Something shifted in her face. The first genuine emotion Nyla had seen from her, and it was not what she expected. It was not anger. It was something that looked briefly and painfully like loss. Like someone who had made a series of irreversible choices and was only now, in this room, feeling the full mass of them. Then it closed again. The calculation came back. She looked at Nyla with an expression that had decided something, and before Kang Jae could react, before Ji-ho, who had appeared in the doorway, could move, Ha-eun's hand went back into her bag and came out with something that was not a folder. The knife was small and fast, and Ha-eun moved with the specific efficiency of someone who had trained for this and also had nothing left to lose. and Nyla felt the cold pressure of it at her throat before she fully processed the sequence of events that had led to it. The room went absolutely still. Hyun's arm was across Nyla's collarbone. The blade was at the left side of her throat, pressed with enough force to communicate certainty without breaking skin. Nyla could feel Hyun's heartbeat through the contact point, elevated, not in panic, but in the particular way of someone who had crossed a line and was committed to whatever came next. Neela's hands were at her sides. She was breathing. Jiho had his hand inside his jacket. 3 other men had appeared from somewhere. Nobody moved. Kang Jae looked at Nyla. She looked back at him. And then something happened that Nyla would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward, trying to find the exact words for it. Kang Jae's hands came off the arms of his wheelchair, both of them at once, pressing flat against the desk. And then, with a slowness that was not weakness but precision, the slowness of something that had been held in place by force of will for a very long time finally being released, he stood up, not fast, not dramatic. The way a mountain shifts, something enormous and slow and completely, terrifyingly final. His hands pressed flat against the desk, and his arms took the weight, and his body unfolded from the wheelchair with the controlled precision of someone who had practiced this exact movement in a private room in the dark for 3 years. And when he reached his full height, the office seemed to recalibrate around him, the geometry of the room changing because the man at the center of it had changed. Nyla felt Hyun's arm go rigid against her collarbone, felt the breath catch in the woman's chest. A single sharp intake, involuntary, the body's honest response to something the mind hadn't finished processing. Kang Jae was taller than she'd understood him to be. Standing, he was taller than most of the men in the room. He stood without assistance, without swaying, his feet planted on the floor of his own office with the solidity of something that had been building to this moment for a very long time. He looked at Hyun. Hyun looked at him. The knife stayed at Nyla's throat, but the pressure of it had changed. The certainty behind it had developed a crack, and Nyla felt the crack the same way she felt cracks in a crowd, through the contact, through the body chemistry of the person pressing against her. "Let her go," Kang Jae said. His voice was different standing. She'd never heard it from this angle, from this height. It came from somewhere lower in his chest, and it had a weight she hadn't felt before. Not louder, not harder, but more present, like the difference between a recording and the live source. "You can walk?" Hyun said. Her voice had lost its calibration. The performance had dropped, and what was underneath it was something raw and off balance and almost unrecognizable from the woman who'd stood in this office 10 minutes ago holding all the leverage. "How long?" "Long enough," he said. "Why didn't you—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. The wheelchair. Everything. "The whole time I've been—" She stopped again. She was recalculating. Nyla could feel it in the arm across her chest, the rapid mental revision of whatever strategy Hyun had walked in here with. "You knew I was alive," Hyun said. "You already knew." "I suspected," Kang Jae said, "for 8 months. Confirmed for 3. And you said nothing." "I was waiting," he said, "for you to come to me. I thought you might. I thought there was some version of you that might come to me and tell the truth without—" He stopped, looked at Nyla, at the knife, at his own hands, which were flat at his sides now, open, not reaching for anything. "Without this." Hyun's arm tightened against Nyla's collarbone, not enough to restrict breathing, enough to communicate that she knew she was losing the room and wasn't ready to accept it. "The folder on the desk," Hyun said. "The accounts. I have copies in 3 separate locations. If anything happens to me in this building today—" "I know," Kang Jae said. "Then you understand I'm not—" "Ha-eun." He said her name the way you'd say the name of something that had once mattered and now needed to be laid down. Not cruel, not soft, just final. "You came here today with a knife and a folder, and you thought that was enough. You thought I would negotiate. You thought—" He stopped. His jaw moved. "You thought she would matter less to me than the accounts." The silence that came after that sentence was different from the previous silences. It had a shape. Nyla felt it land in her own chest alongside the pressure of Ha-in's arm and the cold metal at her throat, and the specific understanding that Kang Jae had just said something true in public that he probably hadn't said to himself in private yet. Ha-in felt it too, and that was when the calculation in her eyes became something else. became the hot, unmanaged thing underneath, became the thing that strategy was usually built to contain. And she moved, not toward Kang Jae, toward the door, taking Nyla with her, the arm shifting from a restraint to a pivot, her body turning so that Nyla was between her and the room, and the knife repositioned from Nyla's throat to a point against her ribs, where the angle made Jiho's hand inside his jacket useless. "Door," Heian said. "Open it." Nobody moved. "Open it or I—" Nyla drove her elbow back. She'd thought about it for exactly half a second, which was about half a second more than she usually had for these kinds of decisions, and what she'd assessed in that half second was Wall, knife at the ribs, arm across the torso, Ha-Yun's feet positioned for lateral movement, not backward movement, the exit door 8 feet to the left. She drove her elbow back into Ha-Yun's solar plexus with every pound of force she had in her body, and felt the impact go through her own arm like a shock, felt Ha-Yun's exhale against the back of her neck. All of it, every bit of available air leaving the woman's body at once, and then she dropped low and moved right. The knife caught her left shoulder. Not deep. A pull, not a stab. Ha-Yun's arm had been going for a grip, not a strike, and the angle was wrong, and Nyla was already moving, so it was the trailing edge of the blade against the top of her shoulder through the fabric of her jacket. She felt it as a line of heat, not yet pain. Pain was coming later. Then Jiho moved, and 2 other men moved, and Ha-Yun was on the floor with her wrist controlled, and the knife gone, and the sound she made was not a scream, but something worse. A sound like something finally giving way after years of holding, a sound that had grief in it under all the other things. Nyla was standing 6 feet away with her hand pressed to her shoulder through her jacket. Kang Jae crossed the room to her. 5 steps. She counted them without meaning to, because some part of her was still cataloging everything even now. 5 steps on his own feet across the floor of his own office, and he stopped in front of her, and his hand came up and pulled her hand away from her shoulder and looked at what was under it. "It's not deep," she said. "I know." His voice was low. He was very close. "I can see that." "I'm okay. I know that too." He wasn't looking at the cut anymore. He was looking at her face. Behind them, Ha-Yun was on her knees with 2 of Jiho's men holding her. She had stopped making the sound. She was just breathing now, jagged and shallow. And the folder she'd brought was still on the desk, and the copies were wherever she'd said they were, and all of it was still a problem that existed regardless of the fact that it had come apart in the last 4 minutes. Madame Seo spoke from near the doorway. Nyla didn't understand the Korean, but understood the tone. The tone of someone with complete authority issuing instructions that had been pre-formed, that had clearly been thought through in advance of today, which meant Madame Seo had known more about the possibility of this than she'd let show. Jiho answered. 2 of his men moved Ha-Yun toward a side door. Ha-Yun said one thing as she was moved, in English, directed at Nyla, with an expression on her face that was the most unguarded thing Nyla had seen from anyone since arriving in Seoul. "He never looked at me the way he looks at you. I want you to know that I noticed. I noticed before he did." Then she was through the door and it closed. The office was very quiet. Nyla became aware, in the quiet, of the pain arriving in her shoulder the way it always arrived after adrenaline. Not a sharp thing, but a building heat, a pulse with weight in it. She breathed through it and kept her hand pressed against the fabric and looked at Kang Jae, who was still standing, in his own office, without the chair. "You need to sit," she said. "I'm fine." "You've been standing for 8 minutes and I can see your right leg shaking." His jaw tightened, but after a moment he moved to the chair behind his desk, a regular chair, not the wheelchair, and sat down with the controlled deliberateness of someone who refused to make it look like relief, even when it clearly was. She sat across from him. Her shoulder was bleeding slowly through her jacket. Mrs. Han appeared from somewhere with a medical kit. Nyla let her work on the shoulder and watched Kang Jae watching her across the desk, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. "The copies," Nyla said finally. "The accounts she mentioned. Jiho will locate them." "How?" "Because I've known for 3 months she was alive, and I've spent 3 months preparing for her to do exactly what she did today. Almost exactly." He looked at the door she'd been taken through. "I didn't prepare for the knife." "Neither did I," Nyla said. His eyes came back to her. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. In 6 weeks of dinners and corridor conversations and arguments over rules and the fever night and the sound through the door, he had never said those 2 words to her. She understood instinctively that they were not cheap words in his mouth, that they cost something, that saying them required a specific kind of decision. "Tell me the rest," she said. "All of it. The parts I don't have yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. The bombing had been contracted by the Huang Syndicate, a rival organization that had been trying to break the CO family's dominance in the region for a decade. Ha-Yun had been recruited a year before it happened. She'd provided intelligence, organizational structure, account access. When the time came, the plan was to eliminate Kang Jae and use the chaos of the family's leadership collapse to move in. Ha-Yun had been promised enough money and safety to disappear entirely, and she'd taken the offer, and she'd staged her death in the explosion alongside the attempt on his life. The bombing had destroyed his spine partially, not completely. That was the part that had never been announced, that had been managed in a private clinic outside Seoul by one physician who had been, along with Madame Seo and Ji-ho, the only person who knew that with time and intensive rehabilitation, the damage might not be permanent. The wheelchair had been real, initially. Then it had become useful. Then it had become strategy. 3 years, she said, alone with that. I wasn't alone. My mother knew. That's not the same. He looked at the desk. No, he said. It's not. And the marriage, she said. She kept her voice level. This was the part she needed, and also the part she'd been aware of since Ha-Yun's comment. Since the way Madame Seo had said, "I believe you can be useful to Kang Jae," the morning she'd brought her to these offices. Your mother said she wanted me here because she thought I could help your recovery, because of my medical background. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. She chose you, he said. I didn't choose this arrangement. You know that. I know, but she chose me for a reason, and I want to know how much of the reason was what she told you it was, and how much was... She stopped. Was what? Was her deciding what was good for you and packaging it as a contract obligation? The silence that followed was long enough that she heard the building around them. The low ambient sounds of the floor, distant voices. The particular quality of a space with significant security that hummed at a frequency just below conscious attention. Both, he said. The contract was real. The strategic value of an American alliance was real. The medical consideration was real. He met her eyes. What I feel for you was not part of the original calculation. She held his gaze. What do you feel for me? He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the cost of what she was asking, could see the specific difficulty of a man who had been stripped open once before and had spent 4 years rebuilding walls of distance and strategy, asking him to say something true out loud again. More than I planned for, he said. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was 4 words delivered by someone who had earned the right to be economical with them, and she felt them land with more weight than most speeches she'd received. She pressed her hand against her shoulder where Mrs. Han had taped a bandage and breathed. There's still the copies, she said. Whatever Ha-Yun filed away, that's still a problem. Yes. And the Huang Syndicate. Yes. And the fact that every person who attended that meeting with the external family representatives last month now saw you sitting in a wheelchair that you've been capable of leaving for longer than you've admitted. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Are you telling me you're leaving? No, she said. I'm telling you the problems aren't solved. I'm not going to pretend they are. Something moved in his face, the smallest thing, the tension around his eyes shifting by a degree, something underneath it that was too controlled to be called relief, but was related to it. Ji-ho needs 4 hours, he said. The copies. There's a protocol for this. We've had longer to prepare than Ha-Yun knew. And after 4 hours, we go back to the compound, and then we... He stopped, looked at the desk again. I owe you a conversation, a real one, not in an office with blood on your jacket. She looked down at her jacket. He was right about the blood. Fine, she said. 4 hours. She used the 4 hours in a small conference room down the hall from his office with a laptop Ji-ho's team provided, and spent them doing what she did when she needed to think but couldn't afford to sit still. She worked. She wrote set lists. She answered emails from her manager. She did the mechanical, familiar work of managing her professional life and let the other part of her brain process what had happened in the last 2 hours without forcing it. Jade called once. She let it ring out and texted, "Can't talk, not in danger, call you tonight." Jade sent back, "That sentence is not as reassuring as you think it is." At the 2-hour mark, Ji-ho came into the conference room and said, without preamble, "The copies have been secured. Haeun's 3 locations, 2 were exactly where she described and 1 was not, but the third was predictable given the pattern of the first 2. He paused. "She's being held. Madame So will determine the resolution." "What does that mean?" Nyla said. Nyla say, Ji-ho looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how specific to be. "It means she won't be a problem," he said. "The method will be Madame Seo's decision. Madame Seo's decisions in these matters are generally..." Another pause. "Proportionate." She nodded. She didn't ask more. There were parts of the world she'd married into that she was still learning the edges of, and this was one of the places where pushing for details served no one. At the 4-hour mark, Kang Jae came to the conference room door. He was in the wheelchair again. She noticed this. Noticed the specific choice it represented, that he'd put it back on for the transit back to the compound, that the revelation in the office hadn't changed the operational structure yet, that he was still managing what was known and when. "Ready," he said. She closed the laptop, picked up her bag, stood up and felt the shoulder pull and breathed through it. In the car, they didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. Seoul moved past the tinted windows in the early evening dark. The city lit and dense and completely indifferent to the specific catastrophe that had resolved and the one that was still assembling itself. "The Hwang Syndicate will know something happened today," Kang Jae said. "Haeun's check-in will be missed. They'll start calculating." "How long before they move?" "Days. Maybe less." He was looking at the window, his profile in the passing light. "There are things I've been preparing, responses, alliances that have been constructed over the last 2 years specifically for this. What today accelerated is the timeline. What does that mean for the compound? Increased security, more restriction on external movement temporarily." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want." "It's what the situation requires," she said. "I understand the situation." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was learning to read. The one that wasn't quite surprise, but was the thing just before it. The thing of a man continuously encountering a version of events that didn't match his expectations. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm angry about a lot of things," she said. "This specific thing, I understand. The marriage," he said, carefully. "What my mother arranged, the reasons. Are you angry about that?" She looked at him. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "Ask me again after you have that conversation you promised me." He nodded once. When they reached the compound, the gates opened and she watched the familiar structure of it close around the car and felt something she hadn't expected. Not comfort, not exactly, but the specific orientation of a body toward the place it had come to recognize as its location. The place where her equipment was set up on the 3rd floor. The place where the Christmas tree lights were still strung in the music room, even though Christmas was weeks behind them. The place where she'd sat in a chair at 4 a.m. and listened to a man burning with fever say the name of the woman who had destroyed him. The same woman who had pressed a knife against her throat today and told her that Kang Jae looked at her differently. She got out of the car and stood in the courtyard in the cold and pressed her hand briefly against the bandage under her jacket and breathed the compound air, which smelled like winter and stone and wood smoke, and heard the gate close behind her. Kang Jae came up beside her. In the chair, the way he'd been in the chair the very first night she'd walked into this courtyard, but she understood now what the chair meant and didn't mean, understood the layer under the layer, and looking at him now was different from every previous time she'd looked at him, and she suspected he could tell. "Come inside," he said. "Mrs. Han will want to look at the shoulder." "I know. And Nyla." He said her name the way he said it now, without the distance it had carried in the beginning, like something he'd gotten used to holding and found he didn't want to put down. What Haeun said, before they took her out. She waited. "She was right," he said. "I want you to know that I know she was right." She stood in the courtyard with the cold pressing against her face and looked at him and said nothing, because some things didn't need a response, and some moments needed to stay exactly as heavy as they were. And somewhere inside the compound, Madame So was waiting, and Jiho was running protocols, and the Huang Syndicate was calculating its next move, and all of it was real, and all of it was coming. But right now, in the courtyard, there was just this. A man who had stood up in his own office for the first time in 4 years, because a woman he hadn't chosen had a knife at her throat, looking at her with something in his eyes that the conversation Kang Jae had promised her didn't happen that night. It didn't happen because 3 hours after they returned to the compound, Jiho came to the main residence with information that changed the timeline. The Huang Syndicate had already moved. Not with violence, not yet, but with something that in some ways was more dangerous than violence at this stage. They had filed documentation with 3 separate regulatory bodies in Korea and 1 international financial oversight committee, flagging the Seo family's primary legitimate holdings for investigation. The accounts Ha-eun had threatened to expose. The documentation was thin, built on inference and strategically placed partial evidence, but thin documentation filed with the right bodies at the right moment could freeze assets and strangle operations faster than any physical confrontation. Kang Jae sat in the main residence study with Jiho and 2 financial advisors until 3 a.m. Nyla knew this because she was awake until 3 a.m., sitting in the music room on the 3rd floor with her headphones around her neck and her shoulder bandaged under a clean shirt. Not playing anything, just sitting in the space that had become the closest thing to her own territory inside this compound. She heard the meeting break up from 2 floors down, the particular quality of a building's silence changing when people move through it, doors, footsteps, the low exchange of final instructions, then quiet. Then 20 minutes later, a knock on the music room door. She said come in before she registered that almost no one came to this floor. Kang Jae opened the door. He was in the wheelchair and he looked the way people looked at the end of something that had demanded everything from them. Not broken, but reduced to essentials, stripped of whatever was non-load-bearing. His jacket was gone. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. He looked at her across the room with an expression she'd come to understand over the past 2 months was his most honest one. The look he had when he'd run out of management and was just himself. I said I owed you a conversation, he said. You did. I know it's late. I wasn't sleeping. He came into the room. She'd set it up over weeks into something that was genuinely hers. The equipment arranged the way she needed it. A couch she'd requisitioned from another room. The Christmas lights still strung along the window ledge. The small folding tree her Chicago friends had sent sitting on the side table with its lights still blinking their slow, patient rhythm. He looked at it. The tree. The lights. You left it up, he said. It makes the room feel less like a foreign country, she said. He looked at the couch, then at her, the unspoken question of whether the space was being offered. She moved to one end and he parked the chair beside the other end, and it was the closest they'd sat to each other voluntarily, without the structure of a table or a desk between them. He told her the rest of it, not the organizational history. She had most of that now. The personal part. The part underneath the strategy. He told her that when he and Ha-eun had been together, he had believed, for the first time since taking over the leadership of the family at 26, that there was a version of his life that might contain something that wasn't the organization. He told her this without sentiment, in the same way he said most things, factually, with the emotion present in the fact rather than wrapped around it. He had been 29. Ha-eun had been 27. He had been, in the specific way of people who are very controlled most of the time, completely unprepared for what it cost when it ended. The bombing didn't just take my legs, he said. What it took was the proof I'd needed to believe something. He looked at the Christmas lights. That I could be trusted with anything outside the organization. That my judgment outside this world was worth anything. Your judgment about Ha-eun was wrong, Nyla said. That doesn't mean your judgment is worthless. It means you trusted someone who had decided to betray you. The mistake was hers. I know that, he said. Knowing it and feeling it are different things. You know that. She did know that. The wheelchair, she said. When did it become a choice rather than a necessity? About 14 months into the rehabilitation. The physician said I had more function than we'd originally believed. That with continued work, the prognosis was better than expected. He looked at his hands. My mother wanted to announce it. She said the organization needed to see strength. I told her the organization would see strength when I decided to show it. A pause. And I needed more time. For the physical recovery. For the other kind. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the compound's nighttime silence and the small, patient blinking of the Christmas lights. The marriage, she said. Tell me what your mother told you about it. He met her eyes. She told me it was strategic. American Alliance, the Brooks family name. She told me it would stabilize certain perceptions about the family's future. He paused. She told me the woman was independent and wouldn't require managing. She said that as if it was a practical quality. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something that had the shape of one. I didn't understand until later that she'd selected for it specifically. That she thought... He stopped. That she thought someone who wouldn't be intimidated by you might be the only kind of person capable of getting through to you, Nyla said. He looked at her. She told me, Nyla said. Not in those words, but she told me. When? Early. Before I understood what she meant. Nyla pressed her hand briefly against her shoulder. The bandage was holding. The pain had settled into a dull, manageable pulse. She also told me you had good reasons for being difficult. She said it like she was warning me. I think she was actually asking me to stay patient. I didn't ask her to do that. I know. She did it because she loves you, and she's been watching you disappear into that chair and that distance for 4 years, and she ran out of things she could do about it herself. She said it plainly, without heat, the way you said true things that had been sitting in plain view long enough that coding them in softness would be a disservice. She picked me because she needed someone who would push back, not someone who'd manage you, someone who'd argue with you. He was very still. She was right, he said, quietly. I know, Nyla said. I'm still deciding how I feel about being selected for it. That's fair. Is it true, she said, what you said in the office, that what you feel for me wasn't part of the calculation? He looked at her for a long time without speaking, and she let him, because this was the kind of question that deserved the time it took. The first night you came into this compound, he said, I expected someone who was frightened or performing courage to cover the fear. Most people who come through those gates for the first time are one or the other. He looked at the window. You came in and asked me where your room was, like you were checking into somewhere you'd temporarily consented to be. He paused. I didn't know what to do with that. I'd been managing people's fear of this family for so long that someone who didn't have it, or didn't show it, felt like a variable I hadn't prepared for. I was terrified, she said. I know that now. I've been terrified most of the last 2 months. You didn't show it. That's not the same as not feeling it. He looked at her. No, he said, it's not. And she understood from the way he said it that he was also talking about himself. She leaned back against the couch cushion and looked at the ceiling. What happens now, she said, with the syndicate, the regulatory filings? We respond, he said. We've been building toward this for 2 years. The legitimate restructuring, the asset transition. What the Huang Syndicate filed today is an attempt to hit us before the transition is complete. They wanted to freeze us mid-process. He was quiet for a moment. They're 3 months too late. The core transition was completed in November. She looked at him. Before I arrived. 2 weeks before you arrived. So the company absorption, Brooks International, that was already part of the legitimate structure. Yes, he said. Everything your father signed on to was already part of the legal framework. Your family's company is protected. He met her eyes. It was protected before the wedding. She absorbed this. Then the urgency, she said. The timeline my father was given, the pressure, was real, he said. The debt was real, but the speed was my mother's decision. She wanted the marriage completed before the transition became public knowledge, because afterward the political calculus of an American alliance would have changed. He paused. I'm not defending it. I'm telling you what was true. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the compound was as still as it ever got, which wasn't fully still, because it never was, because there were always people at the perimeter and lights somewhere and the low operational hum of a place that didn't fully sleep. But it was as close to quiet as she'd heard it. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it straight. Yes. If none of this had happened, if Hayun hadn't shown up today, if the syndicate hadn't moved, if it was just... She paused. If it was just us in this compound for another 6 months, would you have told me any of it? The walking, the real reasons for the marriage, what you feel. He didn't answer immediately. She waited. I don't know, he said. I'd like to say yes. I think the honest answer is that I was moving toward it, that things were shifting, that I felt them shifting and I didn't stop them, which is the closest I've come to choosing something in a long time. He looked at her. But I don't know if I would have gotten there on my own. I'm not built for voluntary exposure. I know, she said. I'm telling you this because you asked for straight. I know, she said again. I'm not angry about it. I'm just accounting for it, understanding what I'm actually working with. He watched her. What are you working with? He said. She thought about it. The real answer, not the careful one. A man who is more capable than he shows and more damaged than he admits, she said. Who has spent 4 years protecting himself from the inside out, and who is... She stopped, looked at the window. Who stood up in his own office today because I had a knife at my throat, and who was sitting in an entrance hall reading a book he wasn't reading at midnight because I'd been out late, and who asked his head of security to watch a crowd's reaction to my music and told him to call it a briefing requirement. She looked back at him. That's what I'm working with. Back it. The silence that followed was the softest one they'd shared. And, he said, the word cost him something. She could hear it. And I'm still here, she said. He looked at her with that expression, the one she'd been cataloging since the first night, the recalibration, the encountering of something that didn't match the estimate. But it was different now. Not surprise anymore. Something that had moved past surprise into something quieter and more settled. He didn't say anything else that night. Neither did she. They sat in the music room with the Christmas lights blinking their patient rhythm until somewhere past 4 in the morning when she fell asleep on the couch with her head against the cushion, and she was asleep when she felt, dimly, someone put a blanket across her, and she didn't open her eyes. And in the morning when she woke, the room was empty, and the chair was gone, and there was a mug of coffee on the side table beside the small folding tree that was still warm. The next 3 months were the hardest. The Huang Syndicate's legal offensive unfolded across February and into March, and fighting it required the kind of sustained attention that left very little room for anything else. Kang Jae worked 18-hour days. She barely saw him, glimpsed him crossing the courtyard, heard his voice from corridors, exchanged brief practical words at meals when he appeared at them. The compound's security intensified. Jiho ran protocols that meant certain wings were restricted at certain hours, that her external appearances were suspended temporarily, that the compound became smaller in ways that tested her. She managed it by working. She finished the mix series she'd been building since December and released it through her Chicago platform and watched the reception from the music room on the 3rd floor, checking numbers at midnight the way she'd once checked crowd energy from behind a DJ booth. The response was strong, stronger than she'd expected, maybe because the material had been made during months that had weight in them. And weight tended to show in the work whether you intended it to or not. Jade sent a voice note that was 8 minutes long and entirely about how proud she was. And Nyla listened to it twice and cried a little and didn't tell anyone. Madame Seo came to the music room one afternoon in the 2nd week of March. Nyla was working and heard the knock and said, "Come in," and the older woman entered and stood looking at the setup the way she'd looked at everything since Nyla had arrived, with total attention and no performance. "I owe you an apology," Madame Seo said. Nyla set down her headphones. "I made decisions about your life without your consent," the older woman said. "I told myself they were necessary, that the situation required them, that the end I was working toward justified the method." She paused. "I believe those things. I still believe some of them, but believing them doesn't mean I wasn't wrong to do it the way I did." Nyla looked at her. "I picked you," Madame Seo said, "not randomly, not purely strategically. I picked you because you reminded me of someone." She stopped. "My husband, when he was young, had a quality, a refusal to be managed by anyone, by circumstance, by expectation." She looked at the Christmas lights still strung along the window. Kang Jae has it too. He needed someone who had it back, Someone who would hold their ground when he pushed, because he pushes as a test and most people fail it without knowing they were being tested. Does he? Buon. She looked at Nyla. You didn't fail it. I didn't know I was being tested, Nyla said. I know, Madame Seo said. That's why you passed. Nyla was quiet for a moment. Is he going to be okay? She said. With all of it. The syndicate. The legal situation. Yes, Madame Seo said, without hesitation, with the specific certainty of a woman who had been holding this family together for 30 years. He's going to be more than okay. He has been building toward this for 2 years, and they moved too late, and he knows it. A pause. What I'm less certain about is the other thing. What other thing? Madame Seo looked at her with an expression that for the first time in their acquaintance was openly, unambiguously warm. Whether he'll let himself have it, she said. He's very good at surviving. He is not good at allowing. She left. Nyla sat in the music room for a long time afterward, with the compound around her and the weight of everything that had been said and not said pressing against the available space, and thought about what it meant to be good at surviving and not at allowing, and recognized it, and didn't enjoy the recognition. In the last week of March, the Huang Syndicate's legal offensive collapsed, not dramatically, in the way that things built on partial evidence and strategic misdirection collapsed, which was quietly documented detail by documented detail. The regulatory bodies finding insufficient basis for the investigations they'd been pushed toward, the filings withdrawn or rejected over the course of 4 days that Nyla tracked through the change in the compound's atmosphere rather than through any direct information. The air in the building shifted. Staff moved differently. Ji-ho, crossing the courtyard on the Thursday, nodded at her in a way that was more communicative than most conversations. That evening, Kang Jae was at dinner. Not just present at dinner, present in the way he hadn't been for 3 months. The full attention of him in the room rather than a portion of it. He sat across from her and his mother and ate actual food at an actual pace, and the lines around his eyes were still there from 3 months of 18-hour days, but they sat differently than they had. It's done, he said, at some point between the first and second course. I know, she said. He looked at her. How? Ji-ho nodded at me this morning. Kang Jae looked at his mother. He nodded at her. Madame Seo said, with perfect composure. She pays attention. After dinner, he asked her to walk with him. She understood what he was asking. She put on her coat and they went out into the courtyard, which was cold still in late March, but with a quality of cold that had spring underneath it. The particular smell of ground beginning to shift. She walked beside him, beside the wheelchair. The pace adjusted, the way she'd adjusted to it over months without noticing the adjustment happening. He said her name once, just to begin with it. Nyla. Yes, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to say it once, and I'm not going to repeat it, because I'm not built for repeating things like this. And I need you to know that once is what I have, and it's real, even though it's only once. She stopped walking. He stopped. They were in the center of the courtyard under a sky that was dark and dense with cloud, the compound lights making a perimeter around them. Okay, she said. I'm in love with you, he said. I don't know when it happened. I know it was before Ha-Yun's office. I think it was the night you stayed when I was sick, but I think it was also before that, in pieces, in every argument, and every time you walked into a room like you had the same right to it as anyone else in it. He looked at her steadily, the way he'd looked at her since the beginning, with complete attention, reading her the way he read everything, but without the distance now, without the buffer of calculation. I didn't choose this arrangement. I didn't choose you, but I'm choosing you now. That's what I have. The courtyard was very quiet. She looked at him. I know, she said. You know. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting for you to catch up. Something moved across his face. The expression she'd cataloged from the first week, the recalibration, the encountering of the unexpected, but softer now, worn in the way things got when they'd been felt enough times to lose their edges. Almost, she thought. Almost a smile. That's irritating, he said. I know, she said. She reached down and took his hand. Not a gesture, or not only a gesture, something more deliberate than that. She held his hand in the cold courtyard of his family's compound with the lights at the perimeter and the spring underneath the cold and everything that had happened in the last 4 months sitting in the air around them like weather that had finally passed. He turned his hand and held hers back. They stood like that for a while, not speaking, not needing to. Then she said, "Come inside, it's cold." "It's not that cold. It's March in Seoul and you're not wearing a coat." "I'm fine." "You said that when you had a fever of 103. He looked at her. She looked back. The almost smile again, closer this time to the real thing, and she registered it with the precision she registered everything about him, stored it, kept it. "Inside," she said. He went inside. In April, he made his first public appearance walking. It wasn't announced in advance. It was a gathering of allied organization heads, the kind of meeting that happened 3 or 4 times a year, at a private venue, attended by people who understood what they were looking at and what it meant. Nyla didn't attend. She stayed at the compound, and she knew it was happening, and she sat in the music room and played a set for no one, just herself, for 3 hours. And when she came down at the end of the evening, Kang Jae was in the main residence study, and she came to the doorway and looked at him. He looked back at her. "How did it go?" she said. "As expected," he said, and then, "Better than expected." She nodded. "Jiho says the Hwang Syndicate's leadership has requested a negotiation meeting," he said, "through an intermediary, the formal kind." "What does that mean?" "It means they're done," he said. "Requesting a formal meeting means acknowledging the other party's position. It's the organizational equivalent of," he paused, searching for the analogy, "of showing your hands." "And what will you do?" "Meet with them," he said. "Accept the negotiation. Establish terms." He looked at the desk. "And then begin the process I've been working toward for 2 years. Reducing the criminal infrastructure. Moving the organization's assets fully into legitimate structures." He looked up at her. "It will take time. It won't be clean. There are parts of what this family has built that can't be easily separated from how they were built." He held her gaze. "I want you to understand what you're staying inside of while that process happens." I understand it," she said. "It could be 3 years. More." "I know. You have a career, a life in Chicago, people who—" "Kang Jae," she said. He stopped. "I know what I'm staying inside of," she said. "I've known since the first week. I'm not naive about what this family is and what it's going to take to change it." She moved into the room. "I'm telling you, I'm here. Not forever without condition and not with my eyes closed, but I'm here and I'm making that choice." She sat down across from him. "Now stop talking like you're trying to give me an exit and start talking about what actually needs to happen." He looked at her for a long moment. "The Brooks International Integration," he said. "There are 3 division heads who need to meet with our restructuring team in the next quarter." "I'll arrange it," she said. "I know those people. My grandfather built those relationships." "There's also the charitable foundation structure my mother has been drafting, the rehabilitation program funding. It needs someone to give it a face that isn't," he paused, "that isn't exclusively this family's face." "I can do that," she said. "You'd be giving up a level of anonymity." "I gave that up when I walked into a reception hall in Seoul in a red dress and met your mother," she said. "I made my peace with it." He almost smiled. There it was. The real one this time, brief and unguarded, there and then gone. But she'd seen it, she'd caught it, and she held it the way she held all the things she'd learned about this man over 4 months in his compound, carefully, without making a show of it. The summer came slowly and then all at once, the way Korean summers did. She flew to Chicago in June for a week. Jiho sent 2 people with her, which she'd accepted with less resistance than she would have 4 months ago, because she understood now what the risk calculus actually was, and she'd decided that understanding it was more important than resisting it. She played a full set at Meridian on the Friday night. The crowd was the same crowd that had always been her crowd, her people, built over years, her real history, and she stood behind the booth and felt the room move and felt herself move with it. And it was the same as it had always been and also permanently different, because she was permanently different, and that was just true. Jade came backstage after and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was how she knew Jade had understood more than either of them had said in their late-night texts over the past months. "Are you happy?" Jade said finally, against her shoulder. She thought about it. "I'm in the middle of something," she said. "It's hard, and it's real, and it's mine. I think that's what I needed. I think I'm getting to happy from the inside of it." Jade pulled back and looked at her. "That man better deserve you." "He's working on it," Nyla said. "So am I." She flew back to Seoul on Sunday. The compound in summer was different. The gardens that had been frost-covered stone when she arrived were dense and green now, the courtyard warm in the evenings. The quality of light completely changed. She walked through the gate and felt the compound's rhythm, the way she'd learned to feel it in the first weeks. And it was familiar now, which was a thing she hadn't known would happen. Kang Jae was in the courtyard when she arrived. Not waiting, or not visibly waiting, because he wasn't built for visible waiting. He was at the far end with a file in his hands and his attention on it, the chair positioned near the stone bench where he had started spending time in the warmer weather. But he looked up when the gate opened, which meant he'd been aware of it. She crossed the courtyard and sat on the bench beside him. "Good set?" he said, without looking up from the file. "Yes." "The numbers?" "Strong." "Good." He turned a page. "Mrs. Han saved dinner." "I'm not hungry yet." He set the file down, looked at her properly, the way he looked at her now. Direct, without management. "You look tired," he said. 7-hour flight. "And?" She leaned her head back and looked at the sky. Summer in Seoul. She'd seen this compound in December and January and February and March and April and all the months between, and here was summer and she was still here. "And I missed it," she said. "Here, I missed it." He was quiet for a moment. "It missed you," he said. It was a strange sentence from him, slightly outside his register, and she could tell he'd decided to say it instead of something more defended, which was still new, was still a thing she was watching him practice. She looked at him. He looked back. In October, 4 months after that, on a quiet morning with autumn moving through the compound grounds, in the red and gold way of Korean falls, Kang Jae wheeled his chair out to the garden at the far end of the east courtyard, the one that had a flowering cherry tree that in spring had been extraordinary and now was a different kind of extraordinary, all color, all the season's last brightness before winter. He sat beside it for a while. Then he stood up, slowly, with the precision that would always be part of how he moved, the specific care of a body that had been rebuilt by will, and left the wheelchair beside the tree. He stood there in the garden without it, in the autumn morning, and looked at the chair for a long time. Nyla was watching from the walkway above. She hadn't planned to be there. She'd been crossing to the east building and seen him from the upper level and stopped. He didn't say anything to the chair. He didn't need to. Whatever was between him and those 4 years and everything they'd cost him was not the kind of thing that needed words. He turned and walked back toward the main building. He saw her on the walkway when he looked up. He stopped. She looked down at him, at this man she'd been handed and had chosen, at the ground he was standing on that was his own ground, in the morning light of a country that had become the context of her life in a way she hadn't chosen and had stopped resisting. "Breakfast," she said. "I'll be there," he said. She went down to the main residence and poured 2 cups of coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden with the cherry tree and the empty chair still sitting beside it, and felt the weight of the last year in her body, the way you felt things that had changed you. Not as a wound anymore, but as a shape. The shape of everything it had taken and everything it had built. He came through the kitchen door 4 minutes later. No chair. Walking, unhurried, the slight particular quality of his gait that was just his and that she'd memorized without meaning to. He took the coffee cup she held out. He stood beside her at the window. They looked at the garden together. "The foundation launch," he said. "My mother wants it in January." "January works. There's a venue she's considering in Kang Jae," she said. He stopped. 5 minutes, she said. "Just this." 5 minutes. He was quiet. Outside the window, the autumn light moved across the garden, across the empty chair beside the cherry tree, across the stones of a compound that had started as a cage and had somewhere along the way become something else entirely. Something with her coffee cup in the kitchen and her Christmas lights on the 3rd floor and her music moving through the walls on late nights, and her name said in a voice that had learned to stop managing it. She pressed her shoulder against his arm. He didn't move away. His hand came up and found hers on the window ledge, and he held it the way he'd held it in the courtyard in March, with the full intention of someone who had chosen it. Outside, a leaf fell from the cherry tree and turned in the still air on its way to the ground, and the compound was quiet, and the empty wheelchair sat beneath the tree like something that had done its work and been set down. And they stood in the kitchen with their coffee cooling and the morning coming in through the window. And Nyla thought about a phone ringing at 2:17 a.m. in a club corridor, about a red dress, about a name she'd written on her palm because she didn't trust her memory when her hands were shaking, about a sound through a closed door at 4 a.m. that had turned out to be a man saying a name that no longer needed to be said, about choosing, inside something you hadn't chosen, until the choosing was the whole of it. She tightened her hand around his. He held on. The morning light moved.